Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Rosanna Francescato, Communications Director with the Clean Coalition, and I'm also leading the Transmission Access Charges campaign. We're excited today to host this webinar on a hot topic, deploying more clean local energy versus expanding our transmission system to deploy more remote energy. Oops. So I want to start today with a few quick housekeeping items. We will email everyone the webinar recording and slides within a couple of business days. Also, all of our webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, under events. If you have questions at any time during the webinar, please go ahead and type them in the question pane at the right of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A, which will follow the presentations. And if you have any questions about the Clean Coalition, you can contact me at rosanna@clean-coalition.org. And now, moving on to today's presentation. We have two excellent presenters with us today. Bill Powers, who is a registered professional mechanical engineer in California and Missouri, with over 35 years of experience in energy and environmental engineering. And Rao Konidena of Raycon Energy, who is an independent consultant focused on providing policy and testimony support, business development, and training in wholesale energy markets. And myself, I already introduced me. You can read more about our presenters' impressive bios on the event listing for this webinar on our website. We'll send everyone the link to that, which will include the webinar recording and slides within a couple of business days. And a reminder, you can type your questions anytime in the question pane. You don't have to wait till the end, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentations. Now, I want to start by quickly setting the stage for today's webinar. First, I want to cover who the Clean Coalition is and what we're about. The Clean Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. Our endgame vision is that we will get to 100% renewable energy within the next 2 decades. And at the Clean Coalition, we're focused on the 25% of that endgame that we believe needs to come from local renewable sources. Local means you're interconnected within the distribution grid where people live and work, and you're facilitating resilience, which is possible because you're avoiding dependence on long transmission lines. Now, when we get to at least 25% local renewable energy, we'll still need to get up to 75% of our energy from remote sources. And these numbers do depend on where you live, and we might get to more than 25%, but we want to get to at least 25% local. But I want to clarify that the Clean Coalition does believe there is a very important role for transmission and for remote energy generation. Despite the title of today's webinar, it doesn't have to be either or. However, local renewables provide significant benefits that remote renewables just can't provide. And the transmission system is incredibly expensive, so we have to get it right. In fact, transmission costs are absolutely out of control throughout the country. They're the fastest growing component of electricity bills in California, where transmission already costs about the same as energy itself. So soon it could actually cost more to move energy around than to generate it. And this is partly because of how the market is designed. That's because transmission is guaranteed a return on equity of 12%. Now, there's no other investment that we know of where you can get that kind of guaranteed return on equity. And this business model made at least some sense when, 1, all energy was generated remotely, and 2, we needed the utilities to build out our transmission system. But the situation today is very different, and we need a new utility business model. So this outdated model with a guaranteed ROE creates massive market distortions and conflicts of interest, and it leads utilities to make spurious arguments for building out more transmission when it's often not needed. And I just want to mention briefly that transmission costs are much higher than they seem, because when you add operations and maintenance plus the ROE, transmission costs go up 10 times beyond their initial capital costs, and these costs are borne by ratepayers. There's a lot on this slide. You can look at it at your leisure later when we'll send them out, but I want to move on in the interest of time. So to optimize the grid for ratepayer savings, you need a lot of local renewables and energy storage. And Southern California Edison, a large utility, did some analysis on this a few years back, and they found that if you properly locate 4 gigawatts of local solar you could preempt $2.2 billion in new transmission infrastructure investments just in their service territory. And remember, that's about $20 billion in ratepayer savings when you consider the O&M. A recent study you may have heard of by Vibrant Clean Energy backs up the SCE findings. This study found that if we deployed enough large solar and wind farms to decrease CO2 emissions by 95% by 2050, Americans would pay $385 billion more for power over the next 30 years. So that's if you focus on just remote energy generation. But if we scale up local solar plus storage in addition to and in close coordination with utility scale renewables, we can achieve the same clean energy goals while saving $473 billion. So that shows how local solar plus storage can save huge amounts of money. So transmission costs to ratepayers are huge and growing. And in California, we have a huge market distortion in the way that transmission access charges, or TAC, are metered and assessed. And that means California ratepayers are paying more than they should for the transmission system, and local renewable energy projects are disincentivized. So here you see an illustration of the distribution grid and the transmission grid. We have the transmission grid up here. And TAC are the usage fees for the transmission grid. In California's investor-owned utility service territories, these fees are being metered and assessed incorrectly at the customer meter, as shown here. And that means you can't tell whether that energy came from the solar rooftop next door or from a power plant 1,000 miles away. They're treated exactly the same, regardless of the fact that the remote energy used the transmission grid and the locally generated energy didn't use it at all. Now, in municipal utility service territories, TAC are already being metered and assessed correctly at the substations between the high voltage to low voltage transmission lines and the low voltage transmission lines to the distribution grid, as shown here. So the way TAC are being assessed in IOU service territories just doesn't make sense. It's like paying extra shipping and handling fees for something you picked up next door, or paying a toll for the Golden Gate Bridge if you pull into your driveway at home. You know, we hear a lot of talk these days about cost shifts, which our next presenter will also cover, but this is the real cost shift that's happening in California. So we have to fix this. And we have to fix it not only because ratepayers are paying these costs, but also because TAC distorts the market by making remote generation look a lot cheaper than it is. And that means 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a lot, is being stolen from local renewables, and that makes them look more expensive. So these charts show how that's happening. People talk a lot about economies of scale of utility scale solar compared to rooftop solar. And in the chart on the left, you can see how when we ignore the transmission costs, and they're basically invisible, remote generation, it does indeed look cheaper. But when you transport that energy over the transmission grid, you have those additional shipping and handling costs associated with the transmission, that 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So once we fix the tax distortion and make transmission costs visible, as you can see here, then local renewables look a lot more cost effective, and you also get resilience and many other benefits at no extra cost. So since overall transmission costs are increasing rapidly, TAC, of course, are also increasing, and in 20 years, they're expected to be at 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's where you get the levelized cost of TAC at 3 cents that we've been talking about, and that's about 50% of the average wholesale cost of electricity in California. So that is huge. The Clean Coalition did a deep analysis on this, and we found that if you fix the TAC market distortion, we'll end up with a lot more local renewables over the next 20 years. If we continued with business as usual, as you see on the top here, we'd have something like 12% of our energy coming from local renewables. But if we fix TAC, we can get that to over 30%, saving Californians over $60 billion over 20 years. And you see that down here. Plus, we're going to just have a lot better outcomes for community microgrids and other deployments of local renewables. So how do we fix TAC? Our proposed reform is simple. Only charge transmission fees for energy delivered through the transmission system, and have procurement reflect both the energy purchase price and the delivery charges. We need CAISO and the CPUC to work together to implement this reform, and we need to get legislation enacted that will compel them to do that. There's a lot of support for this reform. We've gotten over 85 organizations to sign on to our campaign, And we have draft legislation that we've been shopping around to various California state legislators. So we're getting closer. If you'd like to join in this work or sign on as a supporter, just contact me or go to the links shown here. Now, TAP reform may seem like an obscure issue, but it's really key to deploying more local renewables and lowering costs for everyone. And while I've focused here on California, the basic issue of skyrocketing transmission costs applies throughout the country, as we're going to see in the following presentations as well. So it is my pleasure now to turn the presentation over to Bill Powers, who will continue our discussion of local clean energy generation versus remote generation. So let me make Bill the presenter. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you, Clean Coalition, and thanks to my co-presenter, Rao, giving us the Minnesota perspective. So I want to look at local clean energy or remote, who wins the battle. I'm going to move pretty briskly through these slides so we have time for a more animated Q&A afterwards. And let me just get control of advancing the slides. Here we go. So let's do a one-on-one overview of the major players. The number one major player is the customer. The investor in utilities and the cost of service business model are major player. IOUs earn revenue, as Rosanna pointed out, guaranteed rate of return, building infrastructure. Historical driver has been load growth, now renewables and reliability transmission projects, and especially in California, wildfire mitigation have become drivers. California independent system operator, market-based grid operator since 1998, major proponent of new transmission and new generation in urban load pockets. California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, charged with keeping IOU rates just and reasonable, tends to defer to the ISO regarding technical support for new projects. The traditional model does not accommodate distributed generation at the customer site. Edison Electric Institute, which the IOU Nationwide Trade Association observed this with its members back a decade ago. Prospect of declining retail sales earnings, declining major investments in transmission and distribution, potential obsolescence of existing business and regulatory models. Since that time, EEI has become the architect of the NEM solar cost shift attack strategy, which has been going on for years around the country. California's IOUs are on board, at least with EEI, as each gives about $2 million a year to the organization. DG solar is very popular in California, 10,000 megawatts and counting. Chart showing the rapid rise in net metered solar installations in the state. And DG battery storage is also popular and growing. The 2020 bar chart shows about 20,000 installations of DG battery storage, much of it with incentives from the subgeneration incentive program, but a rising phenomenon of installations with both solar and storage. It's also important to note that DG solar has been an integral part of the state's energy and climate strategy for years. We have an energy efficiency strategic plan, calls for rooftop solar on all new residential construction beginning in 2020. Anyone who lives in California, driving around, you see new construction, every rooftop has solar. This strategy also envisioned us getting 25% of existing residential structures near zero net energy by 2020. In some parts of the state, we're getting close. San Diego, I think we're probably 15%, but on average about 10%, still a ways to go. 50% commercial reaches zero net energy by 2030. These are point of use. These are behind the meter targets. We also have AB 327, 2013 legislation. The PUC shall ensure that customer-sited renewable distributed generation continues to grow sustainably. Little housekeeping, types of DG. NEM solar behind the meter, customer site, wholesale DG in front of the meter, sells directly to the utility or to the community choice aggregator. And a subset of that is IOU owned wholesale DG, and we'll look at a project of that type in a minute. Available capacity, do we have enough capacity to go full bore on DG as a solution? I did an evaluation of the city of San Diego's potential last year, found that we had at least 10,000 gigawatt hours a year of available potential on rooftops and parking lots. We need about 4,000 megawatts, 4,000 gigawatt hours to achieve 100% local clean energy build out by 2030. So we have plenty of potential to get the job done. Some price points to keep in mind is through the presentation, 2020 pricing, DG Solar from NREL, a report January 2021 in high solar resource areas, commercial DG about 5 cents a kilowatt hour, residential about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. 2021 Padilla report, annual California Public Utilities report on average utility scale solar and wind costs. Utility scale solar average just under 3 cents a kilowatt hour, utility scale wind about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Just relative current pricing to keep in mind. So, impact of costs of new transmission on the all-in cost of remote wind and solar. I want to look at 3 case studies. SDG&E's Sunrise Power Link, about 1.9 billion capital cost. SCE Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project, about 3 billion. And then for a different reason, I want to look at the SCE El Dorado Ivanpah transmission project. So Sunrise Power Link, I was an expert witness in this proceeding. This was 2006, 2008 timeframe. Capital cost 1.9 billion, annualized cost over 40 years, just over 250 million a year. The transmission line was rejected in the proposed decision October 2008 as unnecessary for near-term reliability and no RPS deficit to meet at that time. However, it was approved in December of 2008 under the quirky alternative decision process at the commission, and SDG&E also voluntarily committed to adding 1,000 megawatts of solar to the line. Fast forward 9 years, there's approximately 1,000 megawatts of solar on the line, and there's an interconnected 265 megawatt wind project. Total renewables production, just under 3 million megawatt hours a year, and dividing the annualized cost over that production, we get about 9 cents a kilowatt hour for the transport, the premium being paid for the transmission. Next project, Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project. Left side is the upper portion of the project in the wind, Southern Sierra wind and Mojave solar development area. On the right is the full project as it comes down into the LA basin. Final cost, just over 3 billion, annualized cost of 400 million a year approximately, based on an extrapolation of the Sunrise Power Link cost relationship. Projected capacity, 4,500 megawatts. Actual capacity, just over 4,000 megawatts. Total renewables production, just over 9 million megawatt hours a year. A better deal than Sunrise Power Link, but still 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour transport charge, or about $45 a megawatt hour. At the same time, these projects were getting rolling through the application and approval process. SCE applied to build a 500 megawatt warehouse rooftop project. And that project was approved by the commission in the summer of 2009 during a brief period of total sunshine for distributed generation at the California Public Utilities Commission. And I will read from the press release of that decision. Unlike other generation sources, these large-scale rooftop solar projects can get built quickly and without the need for expensive new transmission lines. That's my underline. And since they are built on existing structures, these projects are extremely benign from an environmental standpoint, with neither land use, water, or air emissions impacts. So at this time, the commission also initiated a process called the Renewable Distributed Energy Collaborative Process. It hired E3 and Black & Veatch to be the technical consultants. They prepared a number of presentations for the forum. And in this December 2009 presentation, they compared the reference case for getting to 33% renewables by 2020, and you see all the blue transmission lines we need, to a high DG case where we put most of the renewables on large commercial rooftops. And many transmission lines disappear, and those that appear in the high DG case were actually already approved at the time. So, and this is not shameless self-promotion on my part, but they quoted me, E3 and B&V, on, as I was an expert witness in Sunrise Power Link, put a lot of technical information in there and pointed out that with the pricing for DG that was going on SCE's rooftops at $3.50 a watt, we could build more DG solar megawatts on rooftops than the cost of the transmission line, transmission capacity we would need to move it from remote areas. And I appreciated this, that they would incorporate that as kind of a technical vetting of their position, that it could be done better and at no more cost with DG solar, even in 2009. So here's where the sunshine ended. El Dorado Ivanpah Transmission Project 2010. At this point, E3, instead of being under contract to the commission, they're now under contract to big utility scale solar developers, Bright Source, Ivanpah Developer, and First Solar, Desert State Line. And I'm going to read from E3's rebuttal testimony of me, which is 8 months after the statement I just read on the REDEC process. If the commission finds that the El Dorado Ivanpah transmission project is not needed because distributed solar is a superior alternative, then the commission will be unable to approve the applications of any new transmission projects. Well, that may not be a bad outcome, but a fairly draconian statement about the threat of distributed solar. And I have to call E3 out on this, because instead of using the pricing from SCE's project approved by the commission, public pricing, $350 a watt, they use $5 a watt here on behalf of their remote solar clients to attack DG solar as being too costly. And in the consulting business, we call this being client-oriented, but it also makes for doubt in the technical analysis being done. And that's particularly relevant in the solar NEM cost shift controversy. E3 is the commission's technical consultant for technical support materials on this cost shift. There are two, actually. One is E3 Verdant, the other is Next 10 Haas Business School. UC Berkeley came out with a report, short review really, in February 2021, stating the fixed cost gap not being met by NEM solar customers is on the order of $700 to $900 a year, depending on the IOU. In my professional opinion, the primary omission from both efforts is a failure to account for the true avoided transmission value of NEM solar. On the one hand, by reducing peak loads and displacing grid power, it eliminates new transmission builds to address congestion, reliability issues. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you can put the same solar panel on a roof and get the same GHG reduction benefits you get by putting it out in the desert. So you'd have the RPS transmission avoidance benefit that was pointed out in that REDEC process 12 years ago. When you fairly account for both of those benefits of NEM solar, there is no cost shift. So let's look at this in more detail. Let's look at the PG&E case first. 2.6 billion in canceled PG&E projects. ISO attributes those cancellations to both energy efficiency and the unexpected growth of NEM solar for the period of review, which was the 3-year period, 2015-2017. My analysis is that about half of that those canceled projects are attributable to the unexpected increase in NEM solar during that time. Annualized value of that canceled 1.3 billion is about 175 million a year. There were 1,685 megawatts of NEM solar added in PG&E territory in that 3-year period. You run the numbers at $620 per year per NEM system at 6 kilowatt size capacity each in avoided reliability transmission. Now let's look at the RPS value using Sunrise PowerLink as an example. About 250 million a year in cost to transport the output of 1,264 megawatts of solar and wind. The equivalent number of net metered systems, residential, you would need at 6 kilowatts each to provide that same production, about 240,000 systems. Again, do the calculation, that's over $1,000 a year per system in avoided RPS cost. And finally, given that Sunrise is an expensive project, let's look at Tehachapi. So extrapolating based on the cost relationship in Sunrise, 400 million a year in transmission capital cost annualized, 400 or 4,000 megawatts of solar and wind interconnected. To offset that with NEM solar would require about 850,000 systems at 6 kilowatts each. Run the numbers, that's about $500 a year per system in avoided transmission costs. So, significant range depending on the price of the project and how much renewables are on it. But one thing is certain, the combined avoided transmission, peak load, and GHG reduction benefits of NEM solar are at least $1,000 a year per system, which is more than the asserted cost shift. And let's also take a look at the source of these legacy costs that are the basis for this cost shift. One is generation fixed costs. CPUC decision on exit fees in 2018 was very favorable to the IOUs. It's now imposing fixed exit fees on departing load, specifically targeting CCA customers of 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's basically what's showing up in these fixed cost assumptions that are unquestioned by E3 or Haas. I was an expert witness in this proceeding. A fair accounting of reasonable, unavoidable generation fixed cost should be no more than ½ cent per kilowatt hour in 2022 and falling. I mean, this was a very bad decision by the PUC. Transmission fixed costs have been skyrocketing, as Rosanna mentioned, relentlessly, driven by ISO's approvals of transmission projects. We'll take a look at that at the next slide. And distribution fixed costs rapidly rising over the last few years, primarily due to grid hardening, wildfire mitigation related capital investments. And we'll look at that as well. This is a graphic prepared by a colleague of mine, engineer Jaleh Feroz, formerly PE, formerly with SDG&E, comparing the blue, which is a transmission rate-based, asset-based value, to yellow, rise in renewable production, and then gray and orange are peak load growth and annual demand growth. And you can see the spectacular rise in the value of the transmission assets of the utilities from about 5 billion in 2004 up to almost 30 billion in 2020. And this is an op-ed by me, this slide. In my opinion, with ISO, there is never enough supply, and declining, and just an observation, grid reliability continues to decline. I do think California needs to rethink the utility of ISO as the grid operator. Been a huge increase in costs under ISO's watch, yet less grid reliability than we had before they appeared on the scene. Their operations are opaque and counterintuitive. For example, last summer, they were allowing thousands of megawatts of exports under tight demand conditions that ultimately led to rolling blackouts in mid-August. There is diffuse responsibility No one seems to be responsible for the blackouts. And finally, last week, we had flex alerts ordered by ISO under moderately high summer demand conditions, which to me, just as what happened last summer, creates an unwarranted sense of grid fragility in the public mind, when we know exactly what we need to do to assure our grid reliability. And what's the status quo future? Without an emphasis on DG solar, relentlessly rising transmission and distribution costs. Specifically now looking at wildfire mitigation grid hardening. That is projected to cost, among the three utilities, $40 billion this decade, primarily on capital projects such as pole conversions and undergrounding. However, the power shutoffs will continue. This won't solve the problem. SDG&E is seen as the leader, yet no vetting was done in the first project. I was an expert in that project too. No vetting by the PUC of the need or cost of the grid hardening actions. They've since been adopted by other utilities and amplified by a factor of 10 around the state. There's no significant role planned for DG solar plus battery storage, which is an obvious low-cost solution to this problem. Example, SDG&E, out of the 1.5 million customers, only about 30,000 of them live in the extreme high fire threat district. That's an average of 20 customers a mile on 1,600 miles of distribution line. SDG&E proposes to underground at 3.1 million per mile. That's an average of $150,000 in capital outlay per customer for undergrounding. If we do it all, that's a $5 billion project to underground for 30,000 customers. If we don't do that, we save the $4 billion that SDG&E is proposing to spend this decade on this project. That would translate into $16,000 of T&D costs avoided per year, per system, if all 30,000 of those customers have solar and storage, so they can ride out a power shutoff seamlessly without even knowing it's happening. It is time to address the mismatch between traditional revenue methods and modern electric systems. It's called performance-based regulation. You pay the utilities for facilitating and maximizing the value of customer-owned distributed assets. That's happening in New York. This is a graphic from the New York Re-envision the Grid initiative. There's a similar initiative in Hawaii. The orange is showing over time de-emphasizing the traditional cost of service revenue generation engine and replacing it with a service-related IOU function, which is exactly what we've got to do to take full advantage of distributed solar. Conclusions: the traditional IOU cost of service regulatory model is hobbling California's ability to achieve a cost-effective DG future. ISO is not adding value, only much higher fixed costs and poor reliability. The state needs to plan for a future without ISO. DG solar is dampening transmission costs that would be substantially higher without it. It is not being credited with these savings in regulatory models, was my intention there. There is no cost shift. DG solar and storage is a low-cost solution to wildfire mitigation. It should be used for this purpose, and it should be credited for the tens of billions of dollars it will save if it is used in a saturation deployment in high fire threat areas. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. I'm just gonna pass the presenter status to Rao. Okay, go ahead, Rao.
Thanks, Rosanna. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the transmission line case in Wisconsin, the MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator multi-value project line, and also another case study here in Minnesota, close to home, of an investor-owned utilities integrated resource plan. So if we just look at this particular case study on the transmission line, this is a certificate of need, public convenience filing at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin for a line called Cardinal Hickory Creek. This was one of the lines that MISO board approved, the RTO board back in 2011 December. And as one might expect, first argument in any of these transmission lines, or even in any thing that comes out at RTOs nowadays, is about reliability. And so the first, potential justification here, without the line, the applicants basically stated that there is going to be a reliability threat in Wisconsin if this line was not approved in time. And I focused on, in terms of when this case was happening in 2019, it seems so long ago, but I focused on my expertise around how MISO procedures and processes are in place, not only in the control room, but also in terms of the reliability studies that MISO needs to do to comply with the NERC criteria, such as either transmission planning or facilities related compliance criteria. So I was able to state clearly that there is no reliability threat in 2019 in Wisconsin, and MISO has enough standard operating procedures and op guides to handle any near-term needs. The second question here in terms of the applicants from a case study highlight point of view is the applicant stated that the Cardinal Hickory Creek line reduces the operating reserves, and I managed to show, because of my experience at MISO, that MISO, when they became a single balancing authority from 27 or so balancing authorities, that operating reserves were already reduced due to ancillary service market requirements. So that's how that argument played. And then the third one here is about because the RTOs have operated day-ahead and a real-time market, the applicants were stating that in the day-ahead markets, this line is showing up as a consistent need in terms of the binding constraints report. Binding constraints are basically constraints that show up as initiating congestion, transmission congestion on the system. And so when I compared that day-ahead binding constraints report with the real-time constraints report, I saw that this line was not binding that many hours or to that volume in real time. So that's what I focused on as a rebuttal to that particular argument. And then in the middle here, there is a big notion that Cardinal Hickory Creek is one of the multi-value project lines, and so not approving a transmission line that is MISO board approved is going to have a ripple effect on the entire transmission system. But through a data request, we basically saw that MISO approved transmission projects were actually delayed in the past, and some projects were actually delayed as long as 8 years, and even in one cycle there were 26 projects that were delayed, and so that was an argument that I put forth. And then these are some of the similarities here, as you would see, that a transmission line is needed for a generation retirements, and obviously everyone is aware that fossil units are retiring on the system to make way for non-fossil units. So this line is needed for retirements, generation retirements is what the applicant said. And then I showed that these retirements were actually happening well over a decade in Wisconsin to meet the Wisconsin utility goals. Similarly, then the argument was, resource adequacy is a cause for concern here in Wisconsin. And they cited a report that the state agencies get together with MISO into a survey called the Organization of MISO States, OMS MISO survey, that is typically put out in this time of the year that looks 5 years ahead. And so for that particular year, I showed that the Michigan, state of Michigan had the same problem, but then it was okay because it's basically written in the fine footprint on that particular slide in this OMS deck that was referenced by the applicants. And the final argument here from the applicants was, without this line, there will be voltage collapse in Wisconsin. Again, based on what I know about interconnection requirements of interconnecting new renewable requirements, new renewable interconnections, there are mandates in place to provide voltage support and reactive support by FERC, and so that's what I focused on. So, there are different arguments that the applicants came up with, but at least based on my experience at MISO, I was able to show where there is some room for additional analysis and such. So next, I'm going to move to the integrated resource plan of the investor-owned utility here in Minnesota. So if you look at what Rosanna and Bill mentioned in terms of the opportunities for distributed generation, this specific opportunity here in Minnesota is with the Xcel saying that they're going to retire a coal unit SHEDCO and then translate it into a gas unit. But if they don't get to do it, they would have to upgrade the transmission system across the Twin Cities because power is basically going to go through those lines, and we would need to keep reliability front and center. As my small picture to the right shows you, and the reason why I show you this picture is I want you to at least be aware of the Twin Cities metro area, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all the cities. I don't think I have a quiz, but I will show you what I mean, what I'm trying to say here in a second. So the central focus of this particular case study is Xcel did not portray the benefits of high distributed solar to the point that we want to come across. So you'll see that basically we're trying to say that Xcel has to improve, NSP Minnesota basically has to improve its planning to include additional distributed generation so that it becomes basically the central focus of its optimized plan. Because as we look around the industry, market changes, technology development, and even federal policy like FERC Order 2222, it is inevitable that there will be greater distributed resource development occurring, and there is a need that must be accommodated by the integrated resource plan. And so basically the point here is planning for greater distributed resources at this stage in this resource plan is going to, it must be efficient in future. And then the second point here is about the whole interconnection process. I don't have to tell you this, but you already know that the generated interconnection queues at most RTOs are basically clogged right now. There are so many requests in each RTO interconnection queue. So the point that we are making here in this particular IRP proceeding is Xcel has more control over distributed resources interconnected to the Xcel's distribution system, which can avoid the MISO queue process, and hence emphasizing distributed resources allows Xcel to integrate higher levels of renewable resources than by focusing on utility scale transmission connected generation. And that's a big point here as well. And then the third point, I'm going to emphasize this a bit more based on my planning background, that MISO models, which become the source for Xcel's planning models in this IRP, already show that there is enough 3,000 megawatts of distributed generation that is economical throughout MISO footprint. And so those model runs basically demonstrate there is a much higher level of distributed solar that can be economically added to the system than Xcel is currently planning. So which confirms that Xcel should revise and extend its assumptions beyond the level of distributed generation in its high distributed solar sensitivity to determine the transmission and distribution needs. And then last but one point, and I think this is worth mentioning here because we're talking about distributed generation and the role distributed energy resources, especially distributed solar, is going to play, that if we connect all this distributed generation around the Twin Cities metro area in this particular case study, it will show a higher ELCC, effective load carrying capability calculation, which translates into a higher capacity value in these voluntary capacity auction process that MISO has. So there are differences in ELCC of resources that are shown to vary basically by the interconnection node, because ELCC varies by location. And so Xcel and MISO, at least in this report that I mentioned, should jointly work and determine the capacity value of distributed resources through a locational capacity of ELCC. So that's another key point here that we need to think through when we are interconnecting more distributed solar. There is a higher benefit capacity value that DG brings to the table. And then lastly, I think it goes without saying that distributed connected solar basically avoids distribution and perhaps even transmission system costs, as we just saw through Bill's slides even. So aligning this distribution and transmission and resource planning, they all have the word integrated in their beginning. Integrated distribution plan, Minnesota does it. Integrated resource plans, Minnesota has it. MISO's MTAP transmission expansion plan, one could argue it's integrated, but there is nothing like Excel. They don't really integrate the integrated planning efforts, even though it says in the title. So we want basically the utilities to integrate these plans so that these high density distribution related resources, because they are producing more higher capacity in and around Twin Cities area, should be considered in this IRP. So that's basically the nutshell, and I'm going to buzz through a couple of slides here to show at least graphically what is happening in these. The analysis that Excel did is to the right hand side, and the analysis that Institute for Local Self-Reliance, who is a member of Clean Coalition, did is to the left-hand side. You'll see the magnitude of the change here, especially from the incremental DG that is shown by the yellow on these graphs. And I think this goes to show that there is a lot of value that we're missing in Excel's IRP. Because Excel's treatment of distributed solar basically forces the model to optimize around distributed solar rather than allowing the model to optimize the entire system with customer sited solar. So that's a key point here, that Excel should accommodate high penetrations of distributed generation. And customer owned or sponsored distributed generation basically provides increased value because it distributes the profits from renewable generation, such as direct customer bill savings, because the value of a megawatt of solar that is owned by the customers, it produces returns on direct bill savings to the individual customers, whereas a value of a megawatt of utility scale clean energy, it has to be split between the shareholders and the customers, leaving very less for the ratepayer. So that's a key point that I want to drive here. And then moving on to the capacity obligation itself, as you might recall, MISO does not have a PJM like capacity auction, but MISO does have something called a voluntary capacity auction. And in this, investor-owned utilities like Excel do have the option to point to the resources that are in their integrated resource plan as a capacity resource. So that's called the fixed resource adequacy plan, FRAP. So, high distributed solar can be a resource in this FRAP because it could basically play in the energy market. And MISO will study them for deliverability, which means they will be available for all throughout the market. So in this example, which I won't walk you through, you can clearly see hypothetically that if there was 1,000 megawatts of distributed solar in the IRP and it counts towards the capacity obligation, then the obligation that NSP would have is essentially a straightforward benefit of that 1,000 megawatts. Then again, I won't go into the detail on this slide, but this is showing what MISO's models show. There is more than 6 gigawatts of distributed generation potential, and these are just economic, and I'm sure that there are other programs that the model at the entire regional level did not pick, but this goes to show that Excel has a lot more DG PV in the MISO model. And then this is the slide that I wanted to show based on the Twin Cities metro area, because in my mind, when you are already studying as a different planning zones for state of Minnesota, and that's what Minnesota does, and you have a Twin Cities zone that has 8 counties in which mostly Excel is servicing, then if you go down further and drill into the nested loop of Twin Cities metro area, the highest populated counties like Dakota County, Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington, you'll clearly see that there is a hosting capacity available at some of these areas. And for example, the southwest suburb of Eden Prairie in Hennepin County is going to have, let's say, 17 megawatts of hosting capacity. Compare that to the northeast suburb of Dayton's Bluff, it's going to have another 21 megawatts. And not all of these areas would peak at the same time. And that's the benefit that Xcel would have. And this is the same benefit that MISO shows on their value proposition slides, that they benefit from having peaks in Minnesota not at the same time as a peak in eastern in Indiana and stuff. So that's basically the concept here for ELCC. And then finally, distributed generation obviously can defer transmission and distribution upgrades, and that's what we want to see. But unfortunately, on this slide, we don't see it because Xcel has not studied integrated distribution planning and integrated resource planning with transmission expansion planning. And that's my final point, if you will.
Great, thank you, Rao. I'm gonna take the focus off your slides now, and thanks both of you for your great presentations. Let's get right into questions. And we have a number of questions about the ISO. So one is from Kevin Bell, who asks, would an all California ISO, including publics, fix the current problems at CAISO?
So the question is, would an all California ISO fix the problems?
Yeah, including the public utilities.
No, I mean, I think the fundamental idea behind ISO is that, competitive market electric grid will lead to lower prices and higher reliability. And after 20 plus years, we've seen that just isn't, that basic structure is not producing those results. And I do think that at this point, frankly, the ISO is just an unnecessary additional layer of fat. It is not contributing added value. I don't see expanding it. Definitely expanding it would not add value, and it would just lead potentially to more problems.
Great, and we have a question from Lorenzo Christoph, who was formerly at CAISO, asking, what entity do you envision operating the transmission system in California, the balancing authority, if we eliminate CAISO? Well,
I mean, for a century, we operated it with the IOUs. There was no ISO. ISO came in 1998. The IOUs continue to maintain their staffs for transmission operation. They continue to generate projects for approval. And frankly, there are plenty of fine people who are at ISO and who have come out of ISO. That's not the issue. The model is not working. And the model that we had before, at least the operational model, worked better.
So Beverly Deshaud, president of the Electric Auto Association, Central Coast, California, asked who would be able to dump CAISO and what would replace it?
Well, I think I partially answered that by just saying one option is defaulting back to the IOUs to operate their service territory grids, but I put an asterisk by that, but not with this cost of service model, traditional model that we've got. We have to change the regulatory model so that the investor and utilities and the ISO as well are not in a position of just pushing forward projects that drive shareholder value over projects that drive the greatest value for the state of California residents and for California maintaining some type of leadership position in transitioning to distributed generation. Right now, we are at complete loggerheads, and so I'll leave it at that.
So who would be able to make that kind of change?
But those can be initiated either legislatively. It probably would be legislatively. It's a good question. I'm not sure on the drivers behind the New York performance-based regulation process, nor the process in Hawaii. I presume that it was a legislative initiative. It could possibly have been initiated by the state commissions, but that's a good question. I presume it would be a legislative initiative.
Okay. Martin Hertzfeld, licensed PV installer, says, very good points and enjoyable presentation. Are there any examples without ISOs in the States?
Every public utility, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, about 25% of the power in the state is provided to by public utilities to public utility customers. And a useful observation is when the ISO grid was collapsing last summer on August 14th and 15th, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is the third largest utility in the state, was actually selling ISO a few hundred megawatts of power at very high prices. So the public utilities had no issues when ISO utilities under ISO's control were rolling blackouts last summer.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, we could get into more about ISO, but I do want to kind of, since the topic of this was remote versus local generation, I want to get into a question that kind of deals with that from Suds Jane, City Council member for the city of Santa Clara, who asked, what about the added reliability of transmission? Suppose cloudy in LA and sunny in the desert, and wind is not the same as solar, only solar during the day, but wind at night. So how do we factor the value per kilowatt hour of the added additional reliability? Is that something someone is looking at?
Yeah, I think I can take a stab at that. The distributed solar, a couple of things. One, when it's cloudy, generally the loads are not as high, and the transmission system isn't as taxed under those conditions. But with the advent of two things, one, distributed means that even in a city of moderately large size like San Diego, those distributed systems are spread over 100 or hundreds of square miles. And so unless it's completely overcast, there's still a fair amount of production occurring. And we now have the advent of batteries, and batteries have kind of superseded this discussion about, well, we get solar in the day and then we get wind at night, and we'll balance it out by, generally having our solar resources or our renewable resources providing power at different times of the day, which is, not necessarily inaccurate, roughly true. But with the advent of storage, where you can store the generated power, it really supersedes the concern of cloudy here, no wind there. You have a way to take your what's the term of art for wind and solar, the I apologize, just that they're delivering power only for a few hours a day or at uncertain times of the day. That
Intermittent.
Intermittent. Thank you, Rosanna. That the battery allows you to turn those basically into 24/7 reliable resources.
Now, would you have any concerns? Hari Lambda, from coordinator at Brighter Climate Futures, asked, what do we do at night when battery energy runs out? I mean, would it just be a matter of sizing the battery so that doesn't happen? Would you have concerns about that?
Well, I mean, eventually we can, with enough resources, we can lead with batteries and solar and cover those nighttime requirements. But keep in mind that relying on a long line transmission to remote solar and wind energy doesn't resolve that either. You still have intermittent resources that definitely solar won't be available at night, and wind may or may not be. And so the issue of DG solar versus remote wind and solar, in some ways, this point is outside of that
Yeah,
debate.
definitely. Lorenzo has another question for Rao. Can you please explain why DG should have higher ELCC than utility scale solar?
Yeah, sure. I think the nature of DG is going to be that it is spread across different locations. Some of them most likely at the distribution node, but most likely connected to the transmission aspect. And when you spread across multiple resources in different transmission nodes, they are going to have a different locational value, and that value is not currently captured because we are only looking at 8 or 10 peak hours of load historically when we calculate ELCC for wind or solar. So we need to factor in, I think, distributed solar, and you can do a change case of ELCC with distributed solar and storage, which the hypothesis would be that it would have a higher capacity value.
Right, I see Jose Torre Bueno is asking a related question. If local resources have higher ELCC, would that be recognized in California? Does the PUC recognize regional ELCC currently? You know, I know that there's some talk about locational value, but can either of you answer that one?
I think Bill is closer to California.
I can't answer it with complete confidence. And so I think I would be best to pass on that.
And I know that we've done a lot of work on locational benefits, so we can get back to you on that as well. Claire Broom, professor at Emory University, asks, can Bill and co-presenter clarify the mix of behind the meter and front of the meter for DG, not residential?
Clarify, could you repeat that question, Rosanna? Clarify
the mix of behind the meter and front of the meter for DG and not including residential.
Yes, in the case of behind the meter, it would be primarily or partially using the production on site with some export during the day off-site. In front of the meter, the project is tied directly to the distribution grid. So all the power is sent to the grid and none of it is allocated to the on-site load.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Kevin Bell that was related to Bill's presentation. Wouldn't larger net generating systems plus storage increase the net benefit of DR even more?
And the first, larger net generation systems?
Yeah, so systems that are net generating with storage, wouldn't that increase the benefit of DR even more?
And short answer is yes.
I would think so. Here's an interesting.
I got to drop off. Yeah,
okay, thank you very much, Rao. I know Rao had to go to something else, but we really appreciate your time. We can continue with a couple more questions before signing off.
Thank you, Rao.
Thank you. Peter Millman asks, do you agree with the Clean Coalition's rough estimate of 25% DG and 75% imported power?
I actually haven't evaluated it to come to and I'm not dodging this question. I haven't pondered it to determine my position on it.
Yeah, I'll say that, we've done a little research looking at different locations around the country and the world, and there are places that are already doing a lot more than 25%. So we feel like we have to get to at least that, but it's quite possible to get to more in a lot of places. So it's definitely very doable for sure. And that's the amount that we think, is really needed for the resilience and other benefits provided by local renewables. Philip Watts had a question. What is the breakdown of the 3 cents per kilowatt hour cost that is that I pointed out is actually part of remote power delivery over transmission lines? That is the cost of the remote delivery. So basically 3 cents per kilowatt hour is the shipping and handling cost, and that's half of the cost of wholesale generation in California. So it's huge. It's a huge amount. Let's see. So many questions here. Here's one from Kevin Bell also. You know, you're talking about the IOUs taking over operation, and he asked, doesn't that open an opportunity for discriminatory access? And I would add, you know, we're seeing all these issues with the IOU business model, so do we want them to also control the grid?
Oh, I don't see, I mean, the question I was asked is, if not ISO, whom? And one obvious candidate would be the IOUs. But the question, what the questioner brings up is an important point is, but it shouldn't be done as it has been done traditionally. Of course, you have to assure open access, and you have to assure that the IOU's business model isn't contrary to what you're trying to achieve, meaning all they're attempting to do is put steel in the ground and build transmission because it's a very profitable thing to do, not because it makes sense to do it from a power delivery standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so those are, my response isn't just default to the IOUs, it's that they can do it, and they can, but it would have to be done in a different way, which I call performance-based regulation going forward. Mm-hmm. And frankly, PG&E's bankruptcy, if they don't, you know, meet the metrics in the court order, then PG&E may be turned into a public utility. And being a public utility is also an alternative where there is no shareholder-driven drive to, you know, build all this infrastructure that may not be needed.
Great, and yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Joshua Tree, Chief Electrical Officer at the Mushroom Farm, asks, what role do you see for electric cooperatives to play in the DG market evolution?
Well, if the electric co-op is like a Dianza electric co-op, a public supplier, the world is really their oyster. They control their destiny, and they can, if they want to go full bore on DG solar and batteries, they don't have to, they can do it. They don't, it's the standpoint of implementation that there are no impediments.
Mm-hmm. Great, let's see, we're at 12:07. Let's just do one final question from James Dodenhoff, Principal at Silent Running Energy. Are any of the US regional ISOs working well, or is the ISO model simply broken?
In a word, in my opinion, broken.
Yeah, somehow I'm not surprised to hear you say that. Well, it looks like we need new models for a lot of things, including the utilities and the ISOs. Thanks again, Bill, for your presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining our webinar again. And as I mentioned, we will email everyone the recording and slides within a couple of business days. And we will also post the recording and slides on our website under events, where you can also find upcoming events. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.